Having calmed down and expressed myself about the first part of this, I'm finally ready to present my opinion on the rest of what Rationality Rules had to say.
At the New York Law School, a couple of weeks ago, I was debating Angus Johnston, and he describes himself as a First Amendment absolutist. However, he supports the new forms of censorship on campus, like trigger warnings or shutting down meetings that are too extreme and so on. And as he said this, I thought, you know what, there actually isn't necessarily a contradiction between those two things, because you can support the restriction on any government intervention in censorship while also giving a green light towards the more informal censorship.
And so hence, this isn't a First Amendment issue, it's a free speech issue.
Okay, then I will assume the rest of this video is not talking about people who want to make hate speech criminal, despite the fact you earlier claimed this.
The reason I'm using Angus's defence of this position, which is held by a hell of a lot more people than you might think, is because it's a sophisticated rendition, a stillman, if you will.
With this graph on screen. Again, the graph displays a position in favor of legally restricting freedom of speech, a stance at odds with First Amendment absolutism. That graph is of a position that I do not hold, and it should be safe to say that Angus doesn't hold it either.
Anyhow, to prevent myself from getting too far ahead of myself, here's how Brendan responded to Angus during the debate.
Yeah, I want to defend free speech for Nazis, because the idea that you can have free speech but not for Nazis is such a profound contradiction in terms. That's not free speech, that's licensed speech. That's speech that you are licensed... That is speech you are licensed to enjoy so long as you are not a Nazi. That's not freedom of speech. That's the end. That is the end of freedom of speech.
Now, I appreciate that it's hard to hear someone defend the free speech of reprehensible people and ideas, and that on the surface it seems like a moral and logical imperative to silence them, but there's several seriously sincere reasons why we shouldn't, and over the years Brendan has conveyed them with eloquent vigour.
I'll get to those arguments in a moment, but I just feel I need to reiterate this. I won't even speak for Angus here. Perhaps Angus does believe in silencing them, but just not through laws. But my position is not that we should silence them, just like it's not that we should make their speech criminal. My position is that some ideas do not deserve an official platform. It is also that there are other rights and freedoms that can, in some instances, take priority over keeping their speech absolutely limitless. And we appear to disagree specifically in that I believe there are higher priorities for a school of any level than simply ensuring literally anyone can use their stage or other space to spread literally any idea.
For example, in 2015 at Oxford Union, he gave one of the best defences of free speech I've ever seen, which I've linked in the description and cannot recommend enough. But in a nutshell, he explained that 700 years ago, John Wycliffe was denounced and no platform for saying that everyone should be able to read the Bible because his speech was deemed an offence against the ecclesiastical order. That 200 years ago, Percy Shelley was ridiculed and no platform for saying, "I don't believe in God," because he caused maximum offence, and that 100 years ago, the Chameleon magazine was terminated after just one issue for saying a man should be allowed to have sex with another man, because it was an insult on the animal creation. And Brendan concluded by saying,
"Giving offence is good. In fact, it's essential. Humans have long had the urge to offend against the natural order, the religious order, the moral order, and in the process, they have pushed humanity forward. In fact, pretty much every leap forward in history, pretty much every freedom we enjoy is a product of individuals having given offence."
Now, in reply to this, one might say, sure, let's have the freedom to offend, but not the freedom to incite violence. The neo-Nazis aren't just offending people, they're being hateful. But the problem here is that what's conceived as violent speech, or as it's more frequently called, hate speech, is subjective. What one person sees as hate speech, another doesn't.
Having a calmer head and a chance to look this over repeatedly, I see a distinction I missed previously. I want to point it out for two reasons. First, for the benefit of Rationality Rules or anyone else trying to reach out. Maybe I'm an isolated case, just blinded by my anger and frustration when I watched before. But if not, it may act as a barrier to communication. And this is assuming that it was not an intentional conflation or shift. And secondly, so that it's not taken as truly all one thing, or one part or the other mistakenly latched onto and used to shut down any conversation. You started out with your hypothetical opposition opposing the freedom to incite violence, but then shifted to simply hate speech. Look, I understand. Some people conflate it on the other side as well, and maybe that's your intended target, someone who wants to oppose based on little more than offense. There are a lot of complicated topics in play in these discussions, ultimately, and far too many people take a side with little thought and promote it soundbite style. And even that is granting that the person isn't being malicious or seeking to control or destroy. But these two things are not the same. Hate is not violence. It can lead to violence, sure. Its expression, even with no physical action, can even be harmful in some instances. But they're not the same thing. Hate is an emotion. In the context of discussing things like hate speech or hate crime, it's more specifically hate against an entire group based on some arbitrary characteristic like race, sex, religious, sexual orientation, and so on. It is worthy of criticism in its own right, but on its own it's not likely to physically harm or kill somebody. Violence, essentially by definition, and yes, I know, some people are trying to expand it beyond the physical, is exactly that. Physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill. Violence is often hate taking the form of action, but it's not simply hate itself.
I, for example, see the act of advocating Islamic Sharia law as an incitement of violence, because, to say the least, its establishment would result in homosexuals being thrown in prison or killed. To me, Sharia law isn't just offensive, it's violent, and yet notice that I'm not trying to ban Sharia preachers. In fact, I want them to preach their hateful ideology in public, so that people like me can address, ridicule, and destroy it.
Here in the US, we do tend to allow damn near all speech in at least some contexts. And yet, we also have restrictions, even legal ones, when it comes to incitement. Specifically of interest here, there's something called the Brandenburg test. In order for something to be illegal incitement of violence according to this test, it has to be deliberate and imminent, and it also has to be likely to result in a particular action. This actually seems like it would work quite well to ensure that belief can still be expressed publicly, but also allow for some degree of limitation to keep the peace. It leaves it illegal for the Sharia preacher to rally people who already agree and have weapons ready to go kill homosexuals, but the stages before, saying they should be killed, convincing people it's correct, etc., are left legal. Even threatening it in some indeterminate future can be legal there. It also doesn't criminalize speech that may inadvertently lead to violence or criminal behavior, even if that is entirely predictable ahead of time.
Now again, one might reply by saying that they wouldn't personally call the advocating of Sharia law an incitement of violence, but that's actually the point. What is conceived as offence and violence is subjective.
Well, I certainly wouldn't object like that. It's a useless objection, at least worded that way. Frankly, it sounds like a straw man being put up just for you to knock down. A more reasonable objection would be to propose some standard by which to make the judgment on whether something ought to be allowed or prohibited. One example would be the test I mentioned. Is that test too subjective for you? I think that test is useful for legal considerations, but in many other contexts, it doesn't go far enough. For example, things that will predictably, but accidentally, lead to violence. I wouldn't want such things to be criminal. The mere idea of that is horrific. But if you're trying to keep a school or community safe, those things are still very much a problem to consider. Maybe the answer is actually in some enhanced security around the time and place of the predictably violence-inducing speech rather than silencing it. Or maybe the proposed speech doesn't have enough value to deserve a platform and should be relegated to them grabbing a soapbox and standing on the street corner if they're insistent on it anyway. Ultimately, the right to freely express your views is not the same as the right to an audience or the right to a specific stage to do so. Again, a point expressed by Angus, even if less plainly, that you seem to have missed.
So there's the first reason we should give free speech to those we hate. Offence and hate speech are subjective. It's a very slippery slope.
This is an argument against making limits based on subjective terms like hate speech or, especially, offense. I actually agree that's a bad idea for a basis. It's not really an argument against having limits or standards regarding what speech is allowed in the location in question, such as a university campus.
The second reason is that it simply doesn't work.
Stamping out the speech of those who have abhorrent things to say isn't going to work. The reason that those messages are resonant now has to do with the place we are in history. The reason that these people are making progress is that people are now listening for those messages, and anybody who deploys them is going to get a hearing. So the way to approach this is to look at the deeper questions that have put us at a moment of austerity that causes those messages to be resonant rather than the narrow free speech right.
One is that I think this question of, does free speech and free debate work to defeat fascists and that kind of thing? I think that's an empirical question. And I don't think it's sufficient to say that in the Weimar Republic they persecuted Nazis and then there were Nazis, and so therefore you have to have free speech for Nazis. I think we need to look at it in a little bit more complexity. And I think one of the things that I would look at is the question of whether the tactics of Antifa are working right now. And I think there is a case to be made that they are successfully disrupting the organizing of a lot of these white supremacist groups, that the white supremacists are having a hard time getting together. And one of the things that they need is they need to be gathering in public spaces so that the Nazi curious among us can connect up with them in real space, in face-to-face. And if we make it harder for them to do that, then it is harder for them to recruit. Now, is that worth it?
It's amazing how much of what you've presented from Brendan is meant to counter things Angus said, and yet what Angus said that you didn't present can just as easily be played to counter Brendan. And look, if we're talking about making it illegal for them to meet up, I'd certainly say the answer to the question, is it worth it, is no, even if it turns out that it works in the short or mid-term. And it's also not as simple as saying, well, they're having trouble meeting, so that means this is working to destroy the idea. That's not how ideas work. Brendan's points about these things resonating for a reason and needing to address deeper underlying problems are spot on. And the tactics referenced are disgusting and condemnable in their own right. But all of this said, it's not as simple as just saying, that simply doesn't work. It doesn't work on its own, and it has costs that often aren't worthwhile. But, and I genuinely don't even like admitting this, it looks like it may actually work to reduce the spread to some degree. And the opposite side, giving them a platform, or at least an uncontested platform, likely does work to help them recruit. And I say all this as someone who utterly condemns the violence and disruption tactics being used. I say this as someone who desperately wants environments where ideas can be presented and challenged, and where this can be done without dissolving into chaos and becoming a mess of insults, derision, and ultimately either silencing or ignoring people we don't like. And as someone who, sadly, even sickeningly, expects this section to be taken as some defense of or apologetics for that crap anyway. But uncomfortable parts of reality are still, unfortunately, reality. People aren't logic machines. If you put up a bad idea that is resonant all by itself, or even with the appearance of equality to its opposition, some people will be swayed. That's one of the consequences of this kind of free speech. Does that mean we should abandon free speech? Not necessarily. In fact, I think abandoning it entirely is a terrible idea, and I want as much as possible to be legal. But we do have to contend with reality, not pretend the risk and downsides don't exist.
And the third reason to give free speech to those we hate is because not doing so has devastating consequences.
If you want to see the danger of censorship, just look at people like Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos. Their fame, their power to the extent that they have it, their influence, the fact that you all know who they are, even though they don't have any good ideas, is entirely down to censorship.
I honestly think that Brendan's so on the money here. Many of the right's current most prominent figures owe their status, and in some cases entirely, due to censorship. Not due to good ideas or intelligible discourse, but due to them being no platform because they were deemed offensive and/or hateful. History has taught us again and again and again that censorship often has a very heavy price. It empowers the censored, and it deprives ordinary people, like myself, from defeating bad ideas in the only way we truly can, in public, with reason, rationality, logic, evidence, and consistency. If you think someone has a bad, offensive, or even violent idea, let them express it, because without it being public, it has no opposition. The way we rid the world of bad ideas is not by silencing them, it's by discussing them.
The Streisand effect is real too. In response to realizing that something is being kept from them, people will seek it out. And because they're usually not actually being completely silenced, it can be found, usually on the internet. So, if your goal is to destroy a particular person, idea, argument, style of argument, or anything else by refusing it a platform, it may well backfire and give it more publicity. Though, you know what else gives the idea publicity? Giving it a platform. Declaring it bad and fighting it in any way shows it to more people, but ignoring it still lets people see it, just with a false impression that it's fine. It's basically a situation where all answers can lead to a win for the person with the terrible idea. Furthermore, one part of why the limited censorship of these figures has led to their success is quite literally that so many people view it as inherently bad. Seriously. If society looked at someone whining, "The big bad SJWs on campus didn't let me speak there," and went, "Okay, well, you're clearly able to speak somewhere else. You're doing it right now to complain about it." And if they then looked at the ideas and how the person typically presents them and went, "No, your shittiness didn't deserve an academic stage," instead of decrying every single example and abandonment of the underlying principle of free speech, do you really think that would have this result of making them popular? I don't. They gained some audience from events being prevented or shut down. Sure, of course they did. But it's only through a combination of the people who ultimately agree with them and the people who disagree but consider countering their ideas less important than defending their right to say them in these places that we get this particular type of fame. That's not to say you have to mention how horrible they are if you want to discuss free speech and use them as an example, but I do think people reacting to each situation often get their priorities twisted. Now, not every example that can be brought up is equal. If you've got Jordan Peterson set to give a talk actually in his field, and that's shut down because people think he's alt-right and thus the same as Spencer, that's a very different situation. At that point, you've got someone who actually has academic credentials, actually should have something to contribute on the particular topic, and whose speech shouldn't even pose a risk to anybody. And in that hypothetical scenario, that I haven't even actually heard of, the speech is opposed or shut down for irrelevant reasons. He happens to have a controversial, perhaps even bad or dangerous, idea in another area. Even if you have some conservative or religious group trying to have him speak about politics or religion, the situation is still different. But this gets trickier because Spencer has found more socially acceptable ways to spread his ideas, and ways to suggest bringing about certain disgusting ideas without, strictly speaking, violence. While it's disturbing that anyone would want to associate with Spencer and his views, and while in many ways he's the worst individual, it's easier to contrast Jordan Peterson and Milo for this purpose. And, to be abundantly clear, that's not because I think Peterson is in some way more similar to Spencer. It's just that the differences in ideas themselves are not what I need to contrast for this purpose. Maybe this is just my ignorance, and someone can explain or show where I'm wrong. But as far as I can tell, Peterson doesn't have a history of actually discussing specific students and leading to their harassment. And while he's more than willing to disregard the knowledge that things will offend, willing to be, in some sense, deliberately offensive, he didn't literally make his speaking career on trying to hurt other people, even purely emotionally. While he and others may, like Milo, point to emotional outbursts and offense as if they were some kind of gotcha or see the left can't have reasonable conversation, this isn't the same as someone like Milo going out of his way to ensure as many people as possible are offended and outraged beyond the ability to think clearly, just to point to them and go, "See, people who disagree with me aren't rational." So why does that, what Milo did, deserve a stage at an educational institution? And if we're talking about an event or stage that's merely located on campus but doesn't need to be educational, At what point do we consider the risks of harassment or violence towards students, or even just groups that may be targeted by the speaker? Why have we seemingly granted everyone that complains they've been silenced the assumption that they should have been allowed to continue in that place and time? Can we ever discuss where the limits are or should be? Can we ever look at what the consequences are to letting the speech occur and if it's worthwhile in the context being discussed? Or does the fear of what would happen if the government were allowed to shut down whatever they want dictate we declare every major or in some sense public area open to all ideas from all people? Thanks for hearing me out. As always, civil discussion, suggestions, and constructive criticism are welcome in the comments or via social media. Feel free to rate, comment, and share. If you want to hear more from me, subscribe and click the bell for notifications, and check out the description for any sources that I've used.